Why don't you ever speak? Victor Hale's voice sliced clean through the dining room, sharp enough to still the soft clink of silverware against porcelain as 12 guests paused mid-conversation beneath the glow of a 12-foot chandelier, the light catching on crystal glasses and polished marble like something too perfect to be real. And at the far end of the table, Lena Carter stood with a tray in her hands, unmoving, her posture straight, her expression unreadable, like the silence around her belonged to her and not the room. Victor leaned back in his chair, one arm draped lazily over the leather, studying her the way men studied things they believed they owned, a faint smile touching his lips as a few of his guests exchanged glances, unsure whether to laugh or look away. It's strange, he continued, voice smooth, measured, practiced. Most people say something when they're spoken to. A low chuckle rippled across the table, not loud, not comfortable, just enough to fill the space where her voice should have been. But Lena didn't react, didn't lower her gaze like the others did, didn't shift her weight or apologize or rush to explain herself. She simply stood there, still as the glass behind her reflecting the room back at itself. And that stillness, that quiet refusal to bend, made something in Victor's smile tighten almost imperceptibly. He reached for his drink, swirling the amber liquid slowly as if measuring time itself. Or maybe, he added, tilting his head slightly, you just don't think. This time a few guests laughed a little louder, relieved to be told how to feel, relieved to follow the rhythm of his voice. Because in Victor Hale's house, everything had a rhythm, everything moved when he decided it should, everything spoke when he allowed it. Except her. Lena stepped forward then, just one step, silent, controlled, setting a glass down beside a guest with careful precision, her fingers steady, her movements exact, the faint scent of lemon cleaner lingering in the air. As the overhead lights traced along the edge of the tray she carried, and for a brief second, her reflection aligned with Victor's in the long stretch of polished marble between them, two figures facing each other across a distance measured not in feet, but in power. Victor watched her closely now, his eyes narrowing just a fraction, because something about her silence didn't feel empty. It felt deliberate, like a choice, like a wall built on purpose, and that unsettled him more than any reply could have. Look at me when I'm talking to you, he said, quieter this time, but sharper, the room tightening again, conversations fading completely as all attention shifted back to the two of them, and slowly, almost reluctantly, Lena lifted her eyes to meet his, not defiant, not submissive, just steady, like someone who had already seen something and decided. It wasn't worth reacting to. The air shifted, subtle but undeniable, like a pressure change before a storm, and Victor felt it, though he couldn't name it, couldn't place why a woman who hadn't said a single word could make the room feel like it no longer belonged entirely to him. He set his glass down, the soft tap against the table louder than it should have been, and leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice just enough to make it feel personal. Say something. He pressed the command, wrapped in a calm that wasn't quite calm. Anything. And for a long second, nothing happened, the silence stretching, deepening, until it became something almost physical, something everyone in the room could feel pressing against their ribs, waiting. And then Lena spoke, her voice quiet, almost gentle, but clear enough to cut through everything. You changed your name after Chicago, didn't you? And just like that, the room didn't just go silent. It stopped, completely, utterly, as if every breath had been pulled out at once. Victor's expression freezing in place, the confidence in his posture faltering for the smallest fraction of a second, his fingers tightening around the edge of the table as something old, something buried, stirred beneath the surface, because that wasn't a guess, it wasn't a coincidence, it was a memory he had locked away so carefully that even he had almost believed it was gone, and yet here it was, spoken out loud in a room full of people who were never supposed to know, by the one person he had decided didn't matter. No one moved. Not even the man at the far end who had been mid-sip, his glass still hovering inches from his lips, as if time itself had stalled, and Victor felt it in his chest first, that subtle tightening. Like the air had thinned without warning, his eyes locked on Lena as if looking harder might force her words to unravel into something harmless, something explainable, but she did not look away, did not flinch, did not fill the silence she had just created. A faint sound broke through, the slow ticking of the antique clock mounted high on the wall, each second suddenly louder than it had any right to be, echoing through the polished room like a reminder that this moment was real, that it was happening, and Victor straightened slightly, his jaw setting as he let out a small breath that was almost a laugh, almost disbelief. "I am not sure what you think you heard," he said, voice calm again, controlled, practiced, the tone he used when investors asked the wrong questions, when reporters got too close. "But you are mistaken." A few guests nodded quickly, grateful for the explanation, eager to return to something safe, something familiar. But the shift had already happened, subtle but irreversible, because doubt, once introduced, did not leave quietly. Lena lowered her gaze then, but not in submission, not in retreat, simply in completion, as if she had said exactly what needed to be said and nothing more. And that unsettled Victor more than if she had argued, more than if she had pushed, because there was no effort in her, no attempt to prove herself, only certainty, quiet and unyielding. "What did you mean by that?" a woman near the center of the table asked, her voice careful, measured, trying to keep the tone light, but unable to hide the curiosity that now lingered in the room. And Victor turned his head slightly, offering a brief smile, the kind that had closed million-dollar deals. "It means nothing," he replied, quick, precise, "a misunderstanding." But his hand, resting near his glass, had tightened just enough for the knuckles to pale under the warm chandelier light, a detail small enough to miss unless you were looking for it. Lena stepped back then, returning to her place near the wall, the tray once again steady in her hands, her presence fading into the background the way it was expected to. But now it felt different. Now the silence she carried did not feel empty. It felt loaded, like it held more than the room could comfortably ignore. Victor reached for his drink again, this time finishing it in one slow motion. The liquid no longer something to savor, but something to anchor himself to. And as he set the glass down, the faint ring against the table seemed louder than before, sharper, like a punctuation mark he had not intended. "Let us continue," he said, shifting his attention back to the guests, forcing the evening forward, forcing the rhythm to return, and gradually, conversations resumed, quieter at first, cautious, then slowly building back into the low hum of polite discussion. But it was not the same. Something had cracked beneath the surface, something that could not be unseen. Across the room, Lena adjusted the placement of a chair by half an inch, her movements precise, controlled, her face unreadable, but her eyes, for just a brief second, lifted again toward Victor, not challenging, not questioning, simply observing, as if she were watching something unfold that she already understood. And that look lingered longer than any words could have, because Victor felt it. Even without turning, a presence he could not quite shake, a quiet that no longer belonged to him. And for the first time that evening, the man who controlled everything in the room realized there was something he could not control at all, not the past, not the memory she had touched, and certainly not the reason she knew it. The laughter that returned to the table felt thinner now, like something rehearsed rather than real, each voice just a little too careful, each smile just a little too slow. And Victor noticed it even as he pretended not to, his attention drifting despite himself, pulled back again and again to the single point in the room that refused to dissolve into the background. He adjusted his cuff, a small precise motion, the fabric brushing softly against his wrist as he leaned into a conversation about investment projections, nodding at the right moments, offering responses that sounded exactly as they should. But beneath it, something else was moving, something older, something he had not felt in years, not since Chicago, not since the name he had buried beneath layers of success and distance. "Victor, you all right?" one of the men across from him asked, his tone casual but edged with curiosity. And Victor gave a short nod, a practiced half-smile returning to his face. "Of course," he replied smoothly, "just thinking," but the truth sat heavier than that, pressing against his chest with each quiet second that passed. Across the room, Lena shifted slightly, setting down another glass with the same careful precision, her movements measured, almost mechanical, but there was intention in them, a quiet awareness that never wavered. And when she passed behind Victor's chair, the faint scent of citrus and clean linen followed her, subtle, grounding, and for a brief moment, his hand stilled against the table, his breath catching just slightly before he forced himself to continue speaking. He did not turn, not fully, but his eyes tracked her in the reflection of the window beside him, the dark glass mirroring the room back in soft distortions. And there she was again, moving without sound, existing without explanation, as if she had always been there and he had only just noticed. "You said Chicago." The same woman from earlier spoke again, her voice lighter this time, but no less persistent. "Have you done business there recently?" The question hung in the air longer than it should have, simple on the surface, but layered now with something unspoken, something that did not belong to polite conversation, and Victor felt it. The shift, the expectation, the quiet watching. He picked up his glass again, though it was empty, the motion giving him a second to respond, to recalibrate. "Years ago," he said finally, his tone even, dismissive in a way that suggested finality. "Nothing worth revisiting. And that should have been enough. That usually was enough. But tonight, it lingered, the answer settling without satisfying, leaving behind a trace of doubt that refused to dissolve." Lena stopped then, just for a moment, near the far wall, her back partially turned, her head angled slightly as if listening, not to the conversation itself, but to something beneath it, something quieter, and Victor saw it again in the reflection, that stillness, that control, and it unsettled him more now than before because it no longer felt like absence, it felt like restraint. He set the empty glass down again, more carefully this time, and straightened in his chair, drawing a slow breath as he tried to reclaim the rhythm of the room, to pull it back into something he understood, something he could shape. But even as he spoke again, guiding the conversation forward, he felt the fracture underneath, subtle but spreading, because somewhere in this house, in this carefully controlled space, was a woman who knew a version of him that did not belong here, a version he had erased, rewritten, and left behind. And the more he tried to ignore it, the clearer it became that her silence was not a void, it was a choice, and whatever she chose to say next might not just disturb the evening, it might change everything. The evening tried to recover, but it never quite did, the conversations continuing in fragments, polite and measured, like everyone had agreed, without saying it, that something had shifted and no one wanted to be the one to name it. And Victor felt that silence more than he heard the voices, a subtle pressure that stayed with him even as he stood from the table, offering a composed smile and a brief apology about needing to check on something. His tone calm, effortless, the same tone that had carried him through negotiations, through interviews, through every room he had ever dominated. Yet this time it felt thinner, like a layer stretched over something less certain. He stepped away from the dining room, the sound of his shoes soft against the polished floor as he moved down the hallway, past framed photographs and carefully curated art, each piece chosen to reflect control, success, precision, and yet tonight they felt different, like decorations on a story that no longer held. Entirely true. Behind him, the low murmur of guests continued, but it faded quickly as he turned the corner, replaced by a deeper quiet, the kind that settled into the walls and lingered in the air. And for a moment he stopped, just for a moment, his hand resting against the edge of a console table as he drew in a slow breath, steadying himself in a way he had not needed to in years. "Chicago," the word surfaced again, uninvited, sharper now, clearer, and with it came fragments he had spent a long time refusing to revisit, a street name, a building, a version of himself that did not belong to the man he had become, and the fact that she had said it, that she had spoken it without hesitation, without uncertainty, meant something far more dangerous than coincidence. Footsteps approached quietly behind him, light, controlled, and he did not need to turn to know who it was, the presence, unmistakable in its calm. And when Lena stopped a few feet away, the space between them felt measured, intentional, like a line drawn without words. "You should be in the dining room," he said after a second, his voice low, composed again, though not as effortlessly as before, his gaze still fixed ahead rather than on her reflection in the glass beside him. "That is where your duties are." And for a moment, she did not respond, the silence stretching just long enough to remind him that it was never empty when it came from her. "I go where I am needed," she said finally, her voice quiet but steady. The same tone she had used before, the same absence of hesitation, and something in that answer lingered longer than it should have, something layered beneath its simplicity. Victor turned then, slowly, his eyes meeting hers directly this time, searching, measuring, trying to find something that would make sense of her, something that would reduce this moment back into something he could control. "What exactly do you think you know?" he asked, the question precise, deliberate, but there was an edge now, not sharp, not aggressive, just present, like a crack beneath polished glass. Lena held his gaze without shifting, without softening, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, and for a second it felt like the rest of the house had disappeared entirely, leaving only the two of them in a silence that no longer belonged to him. "Enough," she said, and that single word carried more weight than anything else in the room, because it did not sound like a threat, it did not sound like a guess, it sounded like a conclusion, like something already decided. Victor's jaw tightened slightly, the smallest visible sign of the control he was now working to maintain, and he let out a quiet breath, stepping closer by just a fraction, not enough to invade, just enough to assert presence. "Then you will explain," he said, softer now, almost reasonable, but beneath it was something else, something closer to urgency than command, and Lena's eyes flickered for the briefest second, not with fear, not with doubt, but with recognition, as if she had expected that exact response, as if she had been waiting for it. "Not here," she replied, her voice unchanged, and then, without another word, she turned and walked back toward the dining room, her steps as measured as ever, her presence slipping once again into the rhythm of the house. But this time it did not disappear, it lingered, it stayed, and Victor remained where he was for a second longer, watching the space she had left behind, aware now in a way he had not been before that whatever she knew, whatever she carried in that silence, it was not something that would stay hidden much longer, and for the first time in years, he was not the one deciding when the truth would surface. When Victor returned to the dining room, the shift was immediate, subtle but unmistakable. Conversation softened for a fraction of a second before resuming, like a wave adjusting around a stone that had just disturbed its surface, and he noticed how quickly eyes moved away from him, how glasses were lifted just a little too soon, how laughter came half a beat late, and he understood then that whatever had begun earlier had not ended when he stepped out. It had only spread, quietly, invisibly. He took his seat again, adjusting his jacket with deliberate precision, every movement controlled, measured, reclaiming space the only way he knew how. But as he reached for the newly poured drink at his place, his fingers paused just slightly above the glass, because he could feel it again, that presence, not across the room this time, but closer, sharper, like a question that had not been answered. Lena moved behind the guests with the same calm efficiency, placing plates, adjusting settings. Her silence intact, but now it carried weight. Now it pulled attention rather than avoided it, and even those who tried not to notice her found their eyes drifting back, drawn by something they could not quite name. "Victor," one of the investors said, leaning forward with a polite smile that did not fully reach his eyes. "You were saying something about expansion earlier." The question was simple, harmless, but it lingered in the air longer than expected, as if everyone was waiting to see whether he would pick it up or let it fall. And Victor nodded once, slow, deliberate, forcing his focus back into the conversation, outlining projections, timelines, numbers that had always come easily to him, numbers that built certainty, that replaced doubt. And for a moment it worked, the room leaning back into familiarity, into structure, into something he controlled. But then it happened again, quiet, precise. Lena stepping closer to refill a glass near his right, and without looking directly at her, he saw the movement in the reflection of his watch, the angle of her wrist, the steadiness of her hand, and something about it unsettled him in a way he could not ignore, because it was not the movement of someone uncertain. It was the movement of someone who knew exactly where she stood. "Careful," he said suddenly, the words slipping out before he fully decided to speak, his tone calm but edged just enough to shift attention back to him. "Do not spill." A small, controlled remark, the kind that would usually reinforce distance, reinforce order, and for a second, it did, the guest nearest her offering a quick smile, a dismissive nod, but Lena did not respond the way others did, She did not apologize, did not rush. She simply finished pouring, set the bottle down, and then, slowly, lifted her eyes toward him again. The room stilled without realizing it. Not completely, not dramatically, just enough that the space between words grew heavier. And Victor held her gaze this time, not out of curiosity, not out of challenge, but because he needed to understand what she was doing, why she was doing it, how she could stand there in a room built on his authority and remain untouched by it. "You should not worry," she said quietly, her voice even, almost gentle, and yet it landed with a precision that made it impossible to ignore. "Some things only spill when they are forced to stay hidden too long." And the sentence lingered, hanging between them like something fragile and dangerous at the same time. And no one laughed this time. No one moved to smooth it over, because it did not sound like a mistake. It sounded like meaning. Victor's expression did not change, not fully, but something behind it tightened, something that recognized the direction this was going even if he refused to follow it openly. And he leaned back slightly, reclaiming distance, his voice returning to that practiced calm that had always carried him through uncertainty. "Then let us avoid unnecessary pressure," he replied, light, controlled, dismissive enough to redirect the moment. But as he reached for his glass again, his grip was firmer than before, his posture just a fraction more rigid, because now it was no longer just about what she had said. It was about what she was choosing not to say, and the realization settled slowly but firmly in his mind that her silence was not absence, it was control. And for the first time since he built everything around him, he was sitting in a room where someone else might be holding it instead. The air did not recover after that. It only rearranged itself, thinner now, more careful, as if every word spoken at the table had to pass through an invisible filter before it could exist. And Victor felt it in the pauses, in the way people glanced at him, and then quickly away, in the way no one quite dared to return to the easy confidence that had filled the room before. And yet the dinner continued, because it had to, because stopping would mean acknowledging something none of them were ready to name. He lifted his glass again, slower this time, the amber liquid catching the chandelier light as he took a measured sip, the taste no longer sharp or smooth, just present, something to anchor himself to while his mind worked through the edges of what had been said, what had been implied, what had been left deliberately incomplete. Across the table, a man began describing a new development project, something about square footage and projected returns, numbers layered neatly into sentences that should have held Victor's attention, but they did not fully, because his awareness kept splitting, part of him still seated there, nodding, responding, while another part tracked movement at the edges of the room, the quiet rhythm of Lena's steps, the precise placement of her hands, the absence of hesitation in everything she did. She moved again toward the far side, adjusting a chair by a fraction of an inch, aligning it with the table as if the smallest detail mattered. And that detail, that control, struck him now as something deliberate, something that mirrored his own habits in a way that felt too exact to ignore. "You have a very disciplined staff," one of the guests commented lightly, trying to ease the atmosphere, offering something neutral, something safe. And Victor gave a slight nod, the expected response. "Efficiency matters," he replied, his voice steady, but as he said it, his eyes lifted again, just enough to meet Lena's across the room for a brief second. And in that second, the words felt different, less like a statement of pride and more like a question he had not meant to ask. Lena did not look away immediately this time, her gaze holding his for a fraction longer than before, not challenging, not soft, simply present. And then she returned to her task, turning with the same calm precision, leaving behind that lingering sense that nothing she did was accidental. Victor set his glass down once more, this time aligning it carefully with the edge of the table, the movement slower than necessary, deliberate in a way that betrayed the effort behind it. And he leaned back slightly, drawing in a quiet breath as he recalibrated, because control, for him, had always been about rhythm, about knowing when to speak, when to move, when to redirect. And tonight that rhythm was off, disrupted by something he could not yet fully see. The conversation shifted again, drifting into lighter territory, travel, events, safe topics that required nothing personal, nothing revealing. And for a moment, it almost worked, the room loosening just enough to feel familiar again. But then a small sound broke through, the soft slide of a drawer opening somewhere behind the bar area, subtle, almost insignificant, and yet Victor's attention snapped toward it instantly, sharper than it should have. Because instinct told him something had changed, Lena stood there, partially turned, a small leather notebook in her hand. Something simple, worn at the edges, nothing that belonged to the curated perfection of the house. And for a brief second, their eyes met again, and this time there was something different in hers, not calm, not just observant, but intentional, as if a decision had been made. She closed the drawer slowly, the soft click echoing more loudly than it should have in the quiet room. And then she began walking back toward the table, each step measured, each movement controlled. But now there was direction in it, purpose that could not be mistaken, and Victor felt it immediately, the shift, the tightening in his chest, the awareness that whatever line had been drawn earlier was about to be crossed. He straightened slightly in his chair, his hand resting near his glass again, though he did not reach for it this time. And as Lena approached, the conversations around them began to fade once more, not all at once, not dramatically, just gradually, like a room sensing something before it fully understands it. And when she stopped beside him, close enough that he could see the fine details he had ignored before, the steadiness of her breath, the clarity in her eyes, the quiet certainty in the way she held herself, he realized that whatever she was about to do next, it was not impulsive, it was not reactive, it was something she had already decided long before this night began, and for the first time, he was no longer preparing to control the moment, he was bracing for it. Lena did not speak immediately, and that was what made it worse, not better, because the silence stretched again, deeper this time, heavier, as if the entire room had leaned forward without realizing it, waiting for something they could not yet define, and Victor felt it in the way his chest tightened, in the way his fingers pressed slightly against the edge of the table without moving, in the way his control, once effortless, now required intention. She stood beside him, the small leather notebook resting in her hand, its worn edges catching the light just enough to make it visible, just enough to make it real, and without asking, without announcing herself, she placed it gently on the table beside his glass, the soft contact barely making a sound, yet somehow louder than anything spoken that night. A few guests turned, subtle movements at first, then more openly, eyes drawn not to the object itself, but to the shift it represented, because whatever this was, it did not belong to the rhythm of the evening. It did not follow the unspoken rules that had governed everything until now. Victor looked down at the notebook, his expression controlled, composed, but the stillness in his gaze betrayed something else, something closer to recognition than confusion, and he did not touch it right away, did not acknowledge it in the way the moment demanded, because doing so would mean stepping into something he was no longer certain he could contain. "What is this?" he asked finally, his voice low, measured, but lacking the casual authority it had carried before, and Lena remained where she was, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, as if she had already anticipated every possible reaction and chosen this path anyway. "Something you left behind," she replied quietly, and the words settled into the room with a weight that no one could dismiss, because they did not sound like accusation, they sounded like truth. Victor's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and this time he reached for the notebook, his fingers brushing against the worn cover, the texture unfamiliar against the polished surfaces he surrounded himself with. And for a second, just a second, he hesitated, the smallest pause before he opened it, as if some part of him already knew what waited inside. The pages inside were aged, not fragile but marked, filled with handwriting that was not his, not recent, but precise, deliberate. And the moment his eyes scanned the first line, something in his posture shifted, not dramatically, not enough for anyone to name it, but enough that those closest to him felt it. The slight break in the seamless confidence that had defined him all evening. Across the table, someone cleared their throat, unsure whether to speak or remain silent, and no one else moved, because whatever this was, it had crossed beyond polite curiosity into something else entirely, something personal, something that did not belong in a room like this, and yet could not be ignored. Victor turned a page slowly, the sound soft but distinct, and his grip tightened just enough to crease the edge before he corrected it. forcing his hand to relax, forcing himself to breathe evenly. Because the words on the page were not just memories. They were details, dates, places, things that had been buried carefully, intentionally. And the realization came quietly, but firmly, that this was not coincidence, not chance, not something she had stumbled upon. This was something she had carried, something she had chosen to bring here. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice quieter now, more focused, stripped of performance, and Lena met his gaze. Without hesitation, her expression unchanged, her calm unbroken. "I did not get it," she said, and for the first time, there was a subtle shift in her tone, not emotion, not vulnerability, but something deeper, something rooted. "I kept it." And that answer lingered longer than anything else, because it reframed everything, not as discovery, not as interruption, but as continuation. Victor closed the notebook slowly, his fingers resting on the cover as if grounding himself, and the room around them seemed to hold its breath, waiting, watching, unsure whether this moment would collapse back into normalcy or break open into something none of them were prepared to witness. And as he looked at her again, truly looked this time, beyond the role, beyond the silence, beyond the assumptions he had made the moment he first saw her, he understood something that unsettled him more than the notebook itself, more than the past it contained, that this was not about exposure, not yet. It was about timing, about control, about a truth that had been waiting long before this night began, and he was no longer the one deciding when it would be revealed. The room did not breathe, not fully, not anymore. It only waited, suspended in that fragile space between knowing and not knowing. And Victor felt every second of it as his hand remained resting on the notebook, his thumb tracing lightly along the worn edge without opening it again. Because opening it meant acknowledging what he had already begun to understand, and acknowledging it here, in front of everyone, would mean losing something he had built too carefully to risk. "Victor," someone said, quietly from across the table, the voice uncertain now, stripped of its earlier confidence. And he lifted his gaze slowly, the practiced composure returning just enough to hold the moment together, just enough to keep the room from unraveling completely. "It is nothing," he said, the words measured, controlled, but no longer effortless. "Just an old misunderstanding." And he closed the notebook with a soft, deliberate motion, sliding it slightly away from the center of the table as if distance alone could reduce its weight. But the room did not accept that answer, not fully, because the tension remained, subtle but undeniable, and the eyes that followed him now were different, less certain, more aware, as if they were beginning to see the outline of something they had not noticed before. Lena did not move, did not step back into the shadows as she had earlier. She remained exactly where she was, her presence quiet but undeniable, and when Victor looked at her again, there was no avoidance left in his gaze, only focus, only the need to understand how far this would go. "A misunderstanding does not usually require this much silence," she said softly, and the words landed gently, without force, without accusation, yet they settled into the room with a clarity that made them impossible to ignore. A faint shift moved through the guests, a subtle lean, a glance exchanged, the quiet recognition that whatever this was, it had crossed into something real, something that would not be smoothed over with polite conversation. Victor inhaled slowly, steadying himself, his posture straightening as he leaned back, just slightly, reclaiming space in the only way he still could, through presence, through control of his voice. "You are overstepping," he said, calm again, composed. But this time the words felt less like authority and more like an attempt to re-establish it. And Lena tilted her head just slightly, not in defiance, not in submission, but in quiet acknowledgement of what had been said. "Am I?" she replied, her tone unchanged, and for a brief second, something flickered beneath the surface, not emotion, not hesitation, but memory, something carried for a long time, something that had not been spoken until now. Victor's fingers tightened again, just slightly, and he glanced once more at the notebook, then back at her, the connection forming more clearly now, not just between the object and the past, but between her and the story it held, and the realization settled in with a quiet certainty that was harder to ignore than anything she had said aloud. "Who are you?" he asked, And this time the question was not rhetorical, not dismissive. It was direct, stripped of performance, carrying something closer to urgency than authority. Lena held his gaze, steady as before, and for a moment, the room seemed to fade entirely. The guests, the table, the light, all of it dissolving into the background as the space between them narrowed into something singular, something unavoidable. She did not answer immediately, and in that pause, something shifted again, something deeper, because this was no longer about revealing a fact. It was about revealing a truth, something that could not be taken back once spoken. Finally, she stepped slightly closer, just enough to close the distance by a fraction, her voice still quiet, still controlled, but now carrying a weight that had not been there before. "I am someone you chose not to remember," she said, and the sentence did not echo loudly. It did not demand attention, but it settled into Victor's mind with a clarity that made everything else fall away, because it was not just a statement. It was a connection, a link between who he had been and who he had become, and for the first time that night, the control he relied on did not return immediately, did not restore the balance he expected. Instead, it hesitated, fractured, leaving him in a moment where the past was no longer distant, no longer contained, but standing directly in front of him, waiting to be faced. The words did not echo, but they stayed, settling into the space between them with a quiet finality that no one in the room could ignore, and Victor felt them not as sound, but as recognition, something old pressing against the surface of something new, something he had built too carefully to allow cracks. His gaze did not leave Lena's, but something behind it shifted, something calculating, searching, moving through possibilities with the precision that had made him who he was, because memory, for him, had never been about emotion. It had been about control, about deciding what mattered and what did not, what stayed and what was erased. And yet now, standing in front of him, was someone who existed outside that control entirely. "That is not possible," he said quietly, the words measured, but lacking the certainty they were meant to carry. And for the first time that night, his voice did not fill the room. It remained contained, almost private, as if he were speaking more to himself than to her. Lena did not react to the denial, did not argue, did not press. She simply watched him, her expression steady, her silence once again doing more than any response could. And that silence, now, felt deliberate in a way that made it impossible to dismiss, because it suggested patience, the kind that comes from knowing time is no longer working against you. Around them, the guests remained still, no longer pretending to return to conversation, no longer hiding their attention, because, whatever this was, it had moved beyond curiosity into something that demanded witness, something that had drawn a line none of them had expected to see crossed. Victor's hand moved again, almost unconsciously, sliding the notebook closer, his fingers resting on it as if it could anchor him, as if it could provide something solid in a moment that no longer felt entirely stable. And slowly, he opened it once more, this time not scanning, not skimming, but reading, his eyes moving with intention across the lines, across the handwriting that was not his, but was tied to him in ways he could no longer ignore. The details came back in fragments, not all at once, but enough. A street in Chicago, a small office that had not looked like much, conversations that had seemed insignificant at the time, decisions made quickly, efficiently, because that was what he had always done, moved forward, built, left things behind without looking back. And yet here it was, written down, preserved, carried. "You were not supposed to keep this," he said, almost under his breath, the statement slipping out before he could filter it. And Lena's gaze softened, not with sympathy, not with judgment, but with something closer to acknowledgement, as if she had expected him to reach that point. "Some things are not meant to be forgotten," she replied, her voice still quiet, still controlled. But now there was something else beneath it, something rooted deeper than the moment, something that did not belong to this room, this table, this carefully constructed life. Victor closed the notebook again, more firmly this time, his grip tightening just enough to crease the cover before he released it, forcing his hand to still, forcing himself back into the present. Because whatever this connection was, whatever this past held, it was not something he could allow to unfold here, not in front of people who knew him only as the man he had chosen to become. He stood then, the movement smooth but decisive, his chair sliding back with a soft, controlled sound. And for a moment, the room shifted with him, attention following, expectation rising, because this was the moment where he would take control again, where he would redirect, reframe, restore order. "We will continue this later," he said, his tone firm now, composed once more, directed. Not just at Lena but at the room itself, as if the statement alone could contain what had already begun, and for a second, it almost worked, the familiarity of authority settling back into place, the structure of his presence reasserting itself. But Lena did not move, did not step back, did not return to the background, and instead she said one more thing, quiet. Enough that it did not disrupt the room, but clear enough that it reached him without obstruction. "You said that before," and the words stopped him, not physically, not visibly, but internally, halting the momentum he had just begun to rebuild, because they did not refer to this moment. They referred to another time, another place, and that connection, that continuity, made it impossible to treat this as something temporary, something that could be postponed. Victor did not turn back immediately, but he did not continue walking either. And in that stillness, it became clear to him in a way it had not before that this was not an interruption, not an inconvenience, not something he could schedule or delay. This was something that had followed him across years, across cities, across identities, and had finally arrived, not loudly, not forcefully, but with a quiet certainty that made it far more difficult to escape. Victor did not move for a long second after her words settled behind him, not because he did not understand them, but because he understood them too well, the weight of recognition pressing in quietly, steadily, until it became impossible to pretend this was still something he could step away from. The room remained frozen in that suspended state, every guest aware now that something irreversible had begun, something far beyond a disrupted dinner or an uncomfortable exchange, and yet no one spoke, no one interrupted, because even without knowing the details, they could feel the gravity of it, the quiet pull of a truth rising to the surface. Slowly, Victor turned back, not abruptly, not defensively, but with a controlled deliberation that spoke of habit, of years spent mastering moments exactly like this. Except this was not like anything he had faced before, because this time, the narrative was not his to shape. His eyes met Lena's again, and there was no dismissal left in them, no distance, only focus, and something else beneath it, something closer to reluctant acknowledgement. "Then say it," he said, his voice lower now, stripped of the performative ease it had carried earlier. "Whatever you came here to say it." And the invitation was not generous. It was measured, calculated, an attempt to bring the unknown into something defined, something he could respond to, contain, redirect. Lena did not answer immediately, and in that pause, the tension deepened. Again, not sharp, not explosive, but heavy, like a held breath stretching just beyond comfort. And when she finally spoke, her tone did not change, still calm, still precise, but now unmistakably intentional. "You built everything by walking away," she said, each word placed carefully, deliberately. "Not just from places, but from people." And the sentence did not accuse, it stated. It presented itself as something already known, something already proven, and Victor felt it land not as a challenge, but as a mirror, reflecting something he had chosen not to look at for a very long time. A faint shift moved through the room, subtle but present, as the guests absorbed the weight of what was being said, even if they did not fully understand it, because the tone alone, the certainty in it, made it clear that this was no longer speculation, no longer suggestion. This was truth being uncovered piece by piece. Victor's expression remained controlled, but his posture had changed, almost imperceptibly, less rigid, less certain, as if the structure he had relied on was adjusting under pressure he could not fully counter. "You are making assumptions," he replied, but the words lacked the precision they once had, lacking the finality that would have ended the conversation before it began, and Lena's gaze did not waver, did not soften, because she was not testing him. She was continuing something that had already started long before tonight. "Am I?" she said again, echoing her earlier question, but this time it carried more weight, more context, and without waiting for an answer, she reached toward the notebook, opening it to a page Victor had not yet turned to, her movement slow, deliberate, allowing the moment to stretch just enough for everyone watching to feel its significance. She stepped slightly to the side, angling the page toward him, not forcing him to look, but making it impossible not to. And when his eyes followed, when he saw what was written there, the shift was immediate, subtle but undeniable, because this was no longer just memory. It was evidence, something recorded, something preserved beyond his ability to reshape it. "You promised you would come back," she said quietly, her voice steady, unchanged, but now carrying something deeper, something that had waited years to be spoken, and the words did not echo loudly. They did not demand attention, but they landed with a precision that made everything else fall silent around them, because a promise, once named, could not be dismissed as easily as a misunderstanding. Victor did not respond right away, his gaze fixed on the page, on the lines that connected him not just to a place, but to a moment, to a decision he had justified, buried, moved beyond, and for the first time that night, the control he had been holding onto did not return immediately, did not fill the space the way it always had, and in that absence, something else took its place, not chaos, not panic, but realization, quiet and unavoidable, that whatever this was, whatever she had carried into this room, it was not something he could deny his way out of, not something he could reframe into something harmless, because it was not just about what he had done, it was about what he had left behind, and that was something he had never fully accounted for. Victor did not look up from the page right away, not because he did not want to, but because he could not, the words holding him there longer than they should have, longer than he would have ever allowed in any other situation, and the room, still and watchful, seemed to understand that something deeper had taken hold, something that no longer belonged to the surface of conversation. The promise written there was simple, almost ordinary in its phrasing, but that was what made it heavier. Because it had not been meant for an audience, it had not been meant to survive beyond the moment it was made, and yet it had, preserved in ink, carried forward in a way he had never intended. Slowly, he closed the notebook again, this time with care, his fingers smoothing the cover as if that small action could restore some sense of control. And when he finally lifted his gaze to Lena, the shift in him was no longer subtle. It was present, visible in the way his eyes no longer searched for advantage but for understanding. "You should not have come here," he said quietly, and the words were not a command, not a dismissal. They were something else entirely, something closer to regret than authority, and that difference did not go unnoticed. Lena remained steady, her posture unchanged, but there was a slight softening in her expression now, not forgiveness, not acceptance, just recognition, as if this was the moment she had been waiting for, not the revelation, not the confrontation, but the acknowledgement. "I did not come here for this," she replied, her voice calm, grounded. "I came because I needed to see if you remembered." And the simplicity of that statement carried more weight than anything else she had said, because it stripped everything down to something human, something personal, something that could not be dismissed as strategy or intention. Victor exhaled slowly, the breath measured but heavier than before, and for the first time that night, he did not try to fill the silence immediately, did not try to reshape it into something manageable. Instead, he let it exist, let it settle, because there was no version of control that could erase what had already been uncovered. "I remember enough," he said after a moment, and the words were careful, chosen, but not defensive, not evasive, and that alone marked a change, because before, he would have denied, deflected, redirected, but now he stood in the space of it, however uncomfortably. Across the table, one of the guests shifted in their seat, the sound small but noticeable, a reminder that this was not a private conversation, that this moment was being witnessed, absorbed, interpreted by people who had built their understanding of him on something incomplete. And yet Victor did not turn toward them, did not reclaim the room the way he normally would, because for once, the room did not matter as much as the truth standing in front of him. Lena's eyes held his, steady, patient, and for a brief second, something unspoken passed between them, not accusation, not defense, but something closer to shared history, something that existed beyond the roles they now occupied. "Then you know what you left behind," she said, and this time, there was no distance in her tone. No restraint, just clarity, and Victor felt it fully, the weight of it, not as something imposed on him, but as something he had carried all along without allowing himself to look at it directly. His hand moved again, almost unconsciously, resting on the edge of the table, grounding himself in the present, and he nodded once, slow, deliberate, not as agreement, not as surrender, but as acknowledgement, the kind that did not fix anything, did not resolve anything, but made it impossible to pretend otherwise. I thought I had to, he said quietly, and the admission, simple as it was, shifted the room again, because it was no longer about control, no longer about power. It was about something far more complicated, something that could not be measured or managed, and for the first time that night, the man who had built everything on certainty stood in uncertainty, not collapsing under it, but no longer hiding from it either, and that change, subtle but real, marked the beginning of something he had never planned for, something that could not be undone. The admission did not echo loudly, but it settled into the room with a quiet permanence that no one could ignore, and for a moment, everything felt suspended again, not in tension this time, but in something deeper, something more human, and Lena saw it, the shift that had finally taken place, not in his words, but in the way he stood, the way his posture no longer resisted the past but held it. She did not step closer, did not press further, because this was not the moment for force, it was the moment for truth to exist on its own, without being pushed, without being defended against. You thought you had to, she repeated softly, not questioning, not mocking, just placing the words back into the space between them as they were, and Victor nodded once, slower this time, his gaze no longer avoiding hers, no longer searching for a way out of the moment. I believed that leaving was the only way forward, he said, his voice steady but quieter, stripped of everything that had once made it commanding, and for the first time, it sounded like something real, something unpolished, something that had not been shaped for an audience. Around them, the guests remained still, no longer shifting in discomfort, no longer pretending this was anything but what it was, a moment unfolding that did not belong to them, yet held their attention completely, because it revealed something they had not expected to see, not in him, not in this place. Lena's eyes softened again, not with forgiveness, not yet, but with understanding, the kind that comes from having carried something long enough to know its weight. And what about what you left behind? She asked, her voice still calm, still measured, but now carrying something more direct, something that could not be redirected or reframed. And Victor felt that question differently, not as pressure, not as accusation, but as something that required an answer, something that could not remain unanswered without consequence. He exhaled slowly, his hand moving from the table to rest briefly against the back of his chair, grounding himself again, and for a second, he glanced at the notebook, at the evidence of what had been, what still existed, before returning his focus to her. I told myself it would be taken care of, he said, and there was a pause after that, not because he was searching for words, but because he was recognizing them as he spoke them, recognizing the distance between what he had believed and what had actually happened. Lena did not interrupt, did not fill the silence that followed, and that silence allowed the truth to settle more fully, more clearly than any argument could have. But you did not check, she said finally, not harshly, not loudly, just clearly, and Victor did not deny it, did not deflect it, because there was no version of that statement that was not true. The room seemed to shift again, not with tension this time, but with understanding, quiet and heavy, as if everyone present had reached the same realization at once, that this was not about a mistake in business, not about strategy or ambition, but about something simpler, something more human, something that could not be measured in success or failure. Victor's shoulders lowered just slightly, the smallest visible sign that something inside him had shifted, and when he spoke again, his voice carried that change, subtle but undeniable. No, he said, I did not. And the acknowledgement did not fix anything, did not resolve what had been left undone, but it changed the direction of the moment, because it replaced denial with truth. Lena watched him for a second longer, her gaze steady, and then she did something unexpected, something that did not fit the pattern of confrontation or revelation. She reached forward and gently closed the notebook, her hand resting on it for a brief moment before she pulled it back, as if marking the end of one part of the conversation without forcing the next. "Then now you know," she said quietly, and the words were not an ending. They were a transition, a shift from what had been hidden to what had been acknowledged, and Victor understood that, not fully, not completely, but enough to know that this moment was no longer about the past alone. It was about what came after it, what he chose to do now that it was no longer something he could ignore. He looked at her again, truly looked this time, not as a role, not as a presence in the room, but as someone connected to a part of his life he had left behind. And for the first time that night, there was no attempt to control the outcome, no attempt to shape the narrative, only the recognition that whatever came next would not be decided by silence anymore, not his and not hers. No one spoke after that, not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything that mattered had already been placed into the open, quiet and undeniable, and the room, once filled with measured voices and controlled laughter, now held something else entirely, something softer, heavier, more real. Victor remained standing beside the table, his hand no longer reaching for anything, not the glass, not the notebook, not the control he had relied on for so long, because for the first time, he understood that this moment was not something to manage, it was something to face. Lena stepped back slightly then, not retreating, not disappearing, just creating space, the same quiet intention in her movements that had defined her all evening, and for a second, neither of them moved, the distance between them no longer defined by power, but by something far more complicated, something built on time, memory, and the weight of what had been left unfinished. The chandelier above cast a steady light across the table, reflecting off glass and silver, but now it felt different, less like a display and more like exposure, illuminating everything without hiding anything. And Victor felt it, not as pressure, but as clarity, the kind that arrives slowly and does not leave once it settles. "What happens now?" he asked finally, his voice quieter than it had ever been that night, not because he lacked control, but because he no longer needed to project it. And the question itself marked the shift from authority to uncertainty, from command to openness. Lena looked at him for a moment, her expression calm, grounded, and there was no hesitation in her answer, no need to search for words, because she had carried them long enough to know exactly what they meant. "That depends on you," she said, and the simplicity of it held more weight than any explanation could have, because it placed the next step where it had always belonged. Not in the past, not in the moment, but in the choice that followed. Victor nodded slowly, not in agreement, not yet, but in understanding, and, for the first time, the silence between them did not feel like tension. It felt like possibility, something open, something undecided. Across the table, the guests began to shift again, not with discomfort this time, but with awareness, as if they were witnessing not just an unraveling, but a change, something that would not be undone when the night ended. Victor reached for the notebook once more, but this time his touch was different, not hesitant, not guarded, just deliberate, and he closed it fully, sliding it toward Lena instead of away. The motion small but clear, a return rather than a rejection. She accepted it without comment, her fingers resting briefly on the cover before lifting it. And in that small exchange, something passed between them, not resolution, not forgiveness, but recognition, the kind that does not need to be spoken to exist. Victor exhaled slowly, his shoulders easing just slightly, the rigid control that had defined him all evening giving way to something quieter, something more human. And when he looked at her again, there was no distance left in his gaze, only acknowledgement, steady and unguarded. Lena turned then, not abruptly, not as an exit, but as a continuation, moving back toward the rhythm of the room, her steps the same as before, calm, measured, but no longer unnoticed, no longer dismissed. Because now everyone in that room understood that her silence had never been emptiness, it had been strength. Victor remained where he was for a moment longer, watching her go, the weight of everything that had been revealed settling into something he could no longer ignore. And as the room slowly began to breathe again, conversations returning in quieter tones, he did not rush to reclaim it, did not try to restore what had been, because something had changed, not just in the room, but in him. He had built everything on control, on leaving, on moving forward without looking back. But now, standing in the space between who he had been and who he had become, he understood something he had never allowed himself to see before, that what he left behind had not disappeared. It had simply waited, quietly, patiently, until the moment he was finally ready to face it. And in that realization, there was no grand gesture, no dramatic conclusion, only a quiet shift, a different kind of beginning. One that did not erase the past, but acknowledged it, and chose, finally, not to walk away from it again.